I will tell you that Sandy is sort of an unusual name, and I hear it now tens of times a day, and I jump every single time I hear it. And although I am all in favor of raising public awareness for Long Island Sound, this would not have been the vehicle that I would have chosen to do it. But with that said, we are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us this morning to really start in on our conversation about how are we going to respond to the impacts of Sandy. And, as I was thinking about this in preparation, coming so quickly on the heels of Tropical Storm Irene, Snowstorm Alfred, Sandy really had a tremendous impact on us. And it has changed the conversation, at least in our state legislature, and I imagine in the state assembly in New York as well. But it has really changed the conversation around sea level rise, storm response, and climate change. So I think we're well positioned to talk about this. And I'll give you just a quick example. A year ago, our state legislature in Connecticut was discussing a bill that would allow towns to consider in their town plans of conservation and development a little phrase called strategic retreat. Where's my friend David Sutherland? David, and I see Representative Albus with a big grin on his face back there. You'll hear more about this later. But what I would say is that innocent sounding little phrase set off a firestorm. I mean, it really, a genteel firestorm is Connecticut, but still, not a New York firestorm. But at any rate, it was quite something. And here we are, how many months later? This was last spring, so the spring of 2012. We were having this conversation. And here we are in the spring of 2013, and we can't stop people from talking about it, including homeowners who are interested in finding out more about it. It's a conversation at the Connecticut General Assembly and also in New York, obviously with Governor Cuomo's announcement, and also in the halls of Congress. So that is quite a change. And my last personal comment would be that today is the anniversary of the birthday of John James Audubon. So I think that's the real reason they chose. Okay, so our panel, and we're sorry we're getting late. We're going to try and wrap up quickly, but we're going to also let our panelists and you have as much conversation as you need. So we may have to shave a little bit off of lunch, and we think that's to a good purpose. So our panel is entitled Thinking Differently, Building Better. How do we recover from Sandy with resiliency? So what's the funding, the science, and the legal influences on a successful response? And the first panel really talked about what happened and what we can learn from it. This panel begins that conversation about how are we going to respond. And our goal is to have our panelists talk about what types of funds they see coming down the pike, how they anticipate those funds being used to rebuild damaged areas while also incorporating resiliency into all of our government-funded activities. How can we cope along the coast with future storms in the face of that and protect people and infrastructure and our ecology? So that's where we're going to start. We have broken this out into sort of three main themes where we're going to talk about acquisition and restoration. Okay, Laura, where did it go? Acquisition and restoration. I'm sorry if that was my fault, but we're going to talk about the funding, what's coming, how we might use it, and acquisition and restoration in that light. And then we will also. And we'll continue on our conversation looking at where our information and data gaps are and what kind of legal, scientific, policy changes do we need to see in order to be able to fill those data gaps and assemble the information and respond, and then talk a little bit about critical infrastructure and resources. How do we identify and prioritize? And how do we communicate about that and coordinate those efforts? So we're going to try and keep on a very tight timeline. We have just 3 slides, and then Commissioner Whalen brought us some lovely slides, which we'll try and put up also as part of the presentation. Let's see, what else? People have asked if the slides are going to be available, and once we get permission from our presenters, we will either send them out to you, so make sure that you've left your email when you registered, or post them on Save the Sound's website, or both. So, and without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. And I'm going to do a very abbreviated introduction, so if I skip anything, I'm going to turn it to you guys shortly after I just go down the list, so please add anything that you would like. But our first panelist is the Deputy Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Susan Whalen, who we are very pleased to have with us here today. Susan's responsibilities cover the environmental conservation side of the, I can't say side anymore, the portion of the branch, thank you, of the agency. That includes the Bureau of Outdoor Recreation and the Bureau of Natural Resources. So everything from parks, wildlife management, inland and marine fisheries, boating, et cetera, et cetera. Susan also has been key to the success of the No Child Left Inside program, which we all know. She's a veteran environmental conservation official with more than 2 decades of experience under her belt, and she did a lot of good things in Massachusetts before coming here to Connecticut. So thank you for joining us today, Susan. The next panelist we had expected to have with us is DEC Assistant Commissioner for Water and Watersheds, Jim Tierney. Unfortunately, he had an appointment with the governor that he couldn't miss. That came up rather suddenly, so he's not able to be with us here today. But pitching in is my colleague from Audubon, New York, Sean Mahar, who's the Director of Governmental Relations and Communications. He is a graduate of Siena College, where he's now teaching, indoctrinating a new generation of kids. And he serves with me as a co-chair of the Long Island Sound Citizens Advisory Committee Policy Committee, along with Adrian Esposito, who's also here. And Sean is a new dad, so he has a vested interest in seeing our storm response improved. Next in line is Joe McDougall. I first met Joe as one of the most incredible planning and zoning chairs that you might ever meet in a municipality. Although he has not stopped there, he has a vast array of corporate business experience, but he has given all of that up and has now gone to UConn, where he is the professor in residence and executive director of the Center for Energy, Environmental Law. He has degrees too many to mention, but suffice it to say, he has law degrees, MBA degrees, and master's in forestry degrees. So Joe is going to be able to speak on pretty much any topic we bring up today. But I know him from his years in government service, and he was an incredible advocate for protecting a key piece of Long Island Sound at the Griswold Airport. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Larry Swanson from Stony Brook, and he's the director of the Waste Reduction and Management Institute at the Marine Sciences Research Center. Again, Larry also has very incredible credentials. He's worked with NOAA, he has vast experience with estuaries, waterways, and we're very fortunate to have his research conducted on Long Island Sound these days. So, and that concludes the introduction. I'm going to just throw it out to you quickly, just to give us a snapshot of your thoughts about Sandy and anything else you want to add to the introduction in terms of your research interest or the issues facing your agency or your state, and maybe what surprised you most about the storm.
It's almost afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today, and I just want to say that Sandy, although I understand that they've retired the name Sandy from the hurricane list, I'm glad they haven't retired you. So I represent what I like to think of as the fun side of the DEEP in Connecticut, which, as you heard, is boating, fisheries, parks, that sort of thing. But the other parts of the agency are involved in protecting watershed resources, coastal structures permitting, flood control, fish passage, dam safety, water quality, infrastructure, and we've recently added an energy policy to our, which is why we have that second E in our name now. So the DEEP really spans the entire rubric of coastal and environmental protection in Connecticut. In my side of the agency, although we have a lot of fun, one of the things that we've been looking at very closely over recent years is the, particularly along the sound, the sea level rise. And we've been anticipating that a number of our coastal facilities would be affected as the storms became more intense and the seas rose. And in fact, that has happened recently. We've come up with a mantra of move up, move back, create a sustainable natural shoreline, and as a last resort, harden structures. That was until Sandy hit, and with Sandy, we've now added the notion of a buyout mechanism for homeowners to try to induce them and encourage them to leave the shoreline in vulnerable areas. I don't know if you want me to stop there or keep going. Or...
Let's stop again.
Okay.
Let's make sure that your mic, that the mic is turned back on.
Oh, oops.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Do I need to repeat all that? Okay.
Well, thank you, Sandy. It's quite an honor to be representing Jim Tierney today. And I'd just like to make clear for the record, I am not representing New York State in any way, shape, or form on this panel. Mainly just wanted to give some perspectives on, I know, what the state is doing. And Sandy, I guess to answer your question too, for me, what this storm really helped do was really elevate the climate dialogue once again and actually get a number of elected officials, I think, from both parties to really recognize that climate change is happening and we have to do things about it. And it's now, for a long time in the environmental community, we've pushed the state and pushed the federal government to really, take steps to address the threat of sea level rise and climate change. And now we actually have state officials leading the charge. And Governor Cuomo has really stepped up in doing that. His 2100 commission, which is really looking in the future at addressing the state's vulnerabilities and taking steps to mitigate against those and adapt to the new reality in which we live, has been really good. This year he put new money in the state's Environmental Protection Fund to protect natural infrastructure, which is really critical as he sees it to storm protection. He also created the New York Works program in the last few budgets, and this year he's dedicated new money for wastewater treatment plant upgrades. So he's really recognizing that our infrastructure and our natural infrastructure really plays an important role, and from my perspective, that's been really helpful to see, and that's what I am glad that Sandy helped elevate that dialogue once again and actually makes us now walk the walk that we've talked about for a while.
So thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I love addressing rooms where probably most of us all agree on the same thing, so that's always a good thing. As Sandy mentioned, I love my title, Professor in Residence. It sounds like they should give me a condo. I'm at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Lest anyone be confused as to who's leading, we formed our Center for Energy and Environmental Law almost a full year before. But thank you for following our way. But it's a terrific place. We combine the curriculum to try and graduate lawyers who look at both sides, as well as we have a lot of student interest. We place students within the deep and other places. To answer the question you brought up specifically about what surprised me, one of the things I do aside from that is I'm a selectman in Madison. And if you know where Madison, Connecticut is, we were one of the hardest hit, at least as our electrical infrastructure went, under both storms. And how quickly the populace, you take these little political jobs, how very rapidly they become serious. One of the things that surprised me in that role was how little understanding that the public themselves had on what the real world effects of a storm like this came ashore. One lighter example is, there are 2 high tides, and it struck me as remarkable immediately after the storm came through. The next day, which if you remember, the weather turned very nice, and why not go to the Madison Surf Club and stand and watch the tide come in? So as I sat with a bunch of selectmen and the police came in and said, we have a bunch of citizens that are stranded because the water inundated all around them. They didn't realize how far it traveled. It was dramatic. And they said, should we send the skiff to get them? And for a moment I thought, well, there are teaching opportunities, maybe a couple of hours in Madison. But that was by far one of the biggest surprises. I would say also that, as one of the earlier speakers talked about, we could see the real world impact on decades of land use planning. as we look at the difference in the resiliency of marshes. We all know the spongy marshes, how good they are, we've heard it, to see the actual impact on a town in a very close line and how the policy and the legal ramifications created that world. I think it's been a surprise to see it in such stark relief.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Like my colleagues here, it's a pleasure to be here. This is extremely important because I think one of the things that we recognize, those of us that are working with Mark on the Long Island Sound study, is that we have to do a much better job of communicating about Long Island Sound and the consequences of climate change. And I'd just like to say some of the surprises to me that with regard to Sandy were talking to our students who lived on the South Shore of Long Island following Sandy and actually experienced the water level rising in their homes and going through the questions that their families are going through. Do we walk away? Do we rebuild? How do we rebuild? And where do we get the resources to do it? It's a real eye-opener when you actually know some people that are experiencing that. I think also to echo Nikita's comments this morning, I don't believe that many of us really appreciate how fortunate we were around the Long Island Sound area and even on the South Shore with regard to the storm surge. It was devastating, no question. But had it been on the higher of the two high tides, as Nikita's pointed out, it would have been probably 6 inches to a couple of feet higher. Had it been on the stronger full moon tide of the month before, it would have been higher. Had it been in the summer when the water column is expanded, it would have been even higher. So it's very easy to say that, we're thinking in terms of what Sandy created, but we don't have to wait for climate change to probably get another 2 to 3 foot storm surge. It can happen today. The last thing I guess that I find is interesting and surprising in New York State is the debate over what do we do with regard to natural changes. And we're faced with a very interesting phenomenon of do we keep open a breach on Fire Island or do we close it? And, there are many arguments on all sides of the issue, but I really hate to see it boiling down to politics and votes. I hope that we make the decision finally on whether or not this is an opportunity to improve water quality, perhaps rehabilitate shell fishing and so forth, notwithstanding the importance of trying to protect the property owners. But I really hope that we can have a much healthier debate about that than we are currently having.
Great, thank you. So let's start with our first topic, which is really what funding are we going to have, and how do we want to use it? And I don't know, Susan, would you be able to lead us off and just talk a little bit about it? DEEP on the Connecticut side has really been coordinating stakeholders and all of their various branches, and Susan's been heading up that effort.
There are at least a dozen federal agencies that got money as a result of the Storm Sandy bill, and it's broken out into big chunks of money for the USDA, Commerce, Justice, Veterans. I could go through the list. Fish and Wildlife Service. What's challenging about the way this money's been allocated is that each federal agency is developing its own guidelines and rules and timetable for the disbursement of the money. Some agencies are using it entirely within their own boundaries. Others are going to be providing grants and loans to various applicants. As of this week, the governor has decided to put the Department of Energy Services and Public Protection in charge of coordinating the statewide response for Connecticut. And in fact, they're meeting today. So all the agencies will be coordinating as of today. We have been working, as Sandy said, on the environmental front, working with stakeholders and with various NGOs and our state and federal partners to try to identify where resources may be available for things like restoration of environmental systems, thinking as New York is about some kind of a buyout program that might enable us to restore some current homeowner properties to a more natural state. Looking at dredging, looking at infrastructure, looking at on the utility side, looking at microgrids. How can we better set up our utility systems so that they're more flexible and more resilient in the case of storms? Looking at our transportation systems, how we've got an Amtrak train that runs right through a vulnerable coastal area. So we're working with our partners to try to identify where's the money, how's it coming out of the federal government, and what are the deadlines. There's already been they're releasing what's called a tranche. I don't know where that name comes from, somebody else probably does, but the Housing and Urban Development released a chunk of money that's being managed by the one of our sister agencies. So that's a source of funds, $71 million, that we may be able to use to look at assisting with housing-related programs, for example. We're working with NOAA, the idea of doing more mapping and study and assessment of the Long Island Sound resource to see how we can better make a more resilient coastline. So those are just some of the examples. And it's a little bit like herding cats to try to keep up with all this. That's, I guess, the way I would characterize it right now.
I think that's a very kind characterization. Although, if Virginia Simpson from FEMA's here, I don't include you in that characterization. Sean, would you say a couple words from the New York perspective?
Sure. I talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but the 2100 Commission report that the governor put together with a broad group of stakeholders is really looking at targeting funding in the future at important projects that need to be undertaken to really have a balanced approach to storm recovery and future risk reduction. The Environmental Protection Fund in New York State is one of those primary funding sources for environmental projects. We just received an increase in that funding this year thanks to the help of many of you in the room today. And that is definitely helping us protect open space, and the natural infrastructure funding category for water quality improvements was a huge addition to that fund. And also the New York Works program, again, the money for wastewater treatment plants and more clean water projects are really going to help us look to the future to make sure that our wastewater treatment plants can tolerate the capacity that they need to in this new reality that we live in with increased rainfall. But also there's been a great Green Innovations grants program that's been created by the state's Environmental Facilities Corporation to look at incentivizing and really prioritizing green infrastructure solutions to stormwater abatement as well. And we know that was a big focus in the 2100 Commission report. And actually, Jim Tierney did just email me while I was sitting up here too. And he wanted everyone to know that with the big chunk of federal money that's federal agencies are going to be spending that came from the emergency supplemental appropriation, New York is in the process now of really planning for how that money is going to be put to use on the ground. And what they're looking to do is really rebuild smarter and rebuild right, and trying to really ensure that those projects are going to have long-term resilience for the region and for the state as well. So we know that there's a lot still going on. There's a lot of questions still unanswered that the state is looking to bring in stakeholders to help answer and make sure we're moving forward in a collective way. So those are just some of the important categories that we know exist right now. And Sandy, if I could too, I forgot. New York is also looking at a buyout program as well. I know the governor really early on after the storm started talking about it. He got authorization through HUD and FEMA in order to start planning for that. I know they're prioritizing, I think, 2 places in New York where they want to start piloting this program, and in the future I know they want to expand it once they can figure out how to do it, how to work right with the landowners, and what to do with the properties after the fact.
I'm going to move us on to our next topic because that's going to bring us, I think, more to your areas of expertise, Joe and Larry. So I'm going to push this button and hope that works. Nope. There you go. You have to hold the little gizmo the right way. Okay. So really, as we're starting this conversation about how we respond and what resources we have, to make those decisions, it's very clear that we're going to need some additional information. And one of the things we've talked about is, on the science side, what information we need, on the policy side. So Larry, would you kick it off and talk a little bit about what you see on the science side for needs in terms of continuing research or any other issues?
Well, I think looking at the storm, first of all, we did, I think, an excellent job of predicting where the storm would go. I think if you were to fault the predictions at all, it was with the intensity with which it hit and the persistence with which it lasted. So there's always going to be a request of how can we make better predictions so that we can warn people better in the future. And I think it's also imperative on us in the scientific community to try to focus down more at the local level rather than with the broad spectrum, because a lot of people in local communities just don't appreciate how much they're going to be impacted either in their little embayment or on their own personal property. So we got to try to improve there. I think another place that we need improvement is that after the storm, there was really a need as well as an opportunity to understand quickly what actually happened. And again, going to the South Shore of Long Island, we had a number of pollution issues that were similar to what were talked about a little earlier today. We had the Bay Park sewage treatment plant that was badly flooded. We had oil tanks that were ruptured and so forth. And the state really should have had a means, the university should have had a means to getting out there and analyzing the situation on the ground as soon as possible so that we could begin to take informed measures with regard to what correction could be implemented.
Thank you. I know that was actually a challenge for all of us, both from the NGO side and from the state agency side, was actually getting out to the field to assess the damage. Joe, do you want to sort of build on that and talk about what you see coming on the policy side, or from the local legal front?
Sure.
Or both?
So one of the most important things, I hope that there are a lot of important things. One important thing that I hope comes out of the funding is an opportunity to fix a problem that rests really more in Connecticut. Connecticut, our 10th Amendment of our Constitution, makes us a home rule state. The reality is that so much of what we do, the reality of our environment, is controlled at the town. 169 towns, immense power. So I'll tell you, Sandy made reference to it. I was a zoning chair for a very long time. And I sat on a commission, a fairly intense condo development that was proposed in one of our towns in the early 2000s, and they brought in an MIT professor to talk about sea level rise. With a sea level rise. And actually we asked our town council and said, tell us, could we actually turn it down? He said, no, we really couldn't vote it. That's not something we can consider. Flash forward, a decade later, our town, we led a preservation effort to buy that same land back. And one of the reasons was to talk about sea level rise. And so that's really a blip of time. The law just doesn't respond that quickly. It's not a real fast-moving organization. To our mind, if we look at the fact that there's so much power in those local towns, how do we tell them? They're facing a common problem, yet we have a town engineer, they're good engineers, they're civil engineers. That doesn't mean they can respond to climate change. How do you tell the commission, the next one that's voting, say, this is the development where you need to say no to redevelopment? When's that first decision? So if we think about money where we have that problem, to say, how do we communicate with them? How do we develop and plan with them in a very local-based system? How do we engage in regional planning? How do we serve as a clearinghouse of information and give the political units the ability to actually do what they should do? They need to see it as part of a broader plan. To my mind, it doesn't move quickly, but that's the type of thing that'll make a difference over a decade's worth of time. If I could talk just about one other thing, you mentioned it earlier. is that since obviously the story of the storms in our town talks about destruction, but also talks about electrical infrastructure, I'm glad to see that the state made a change about a year or so ago on microgrids, the ability to cut off into island power units. We still have a challenge with something called submetering. Submetering is the ability to let private developers create renewable energy sources and then to charge the people that are serving that problem. In New York State, that's a trivial matter. In Connecticut, it means that you become an unregulated utility, making it virtually impossible. Ironic for the fuel cell state. Those are the types of things that are a big legal challenge. It's actually in the governor's current proposal to fix it. But even once that gets done, how do municipalities plan to build out this other electrical infrastructure to harden our grid and make us more resilient to these type of efforts as they come forward? It's really one of the other most important thing aside from direct protection.
Thank you. Susan or Sean, do you want to hop on to that? Anything to add?
I mentioned earlier, for those of you who could hear me, we're trying to walk the talk in the environmental conservation branch that I manage, and it just so happens that one of our largest and most popular parks in Connecticut is located in Madison. It's Hammonasset Beach State Park, 2 miles of beautiful ocean beach along the Sound, 553 campsites, and we had a pair of circa 1950s bathhouses that, when they were built, were 200 feet from the water's edge. Hurricane Irene took those bathhouses out. So that shows you how much the water had advanced in the previous 50 years. So we're walking the talk. We've created a dune system where those buildings were. We're moving a new bathhouse structure several hundred feet back from the current water's edge, moving it up, making it a green building, and hopefully being leading by example and demonstrating what can be done when you've got the room, obviously, to make shorefront buildings more resilient.
And Sandy, I'll just add a few quick things on the policy front from New York, and adopting sea level rise projections for the state planning is something that's really important, as we continue to push for, because we have to recognize that the sea level is rising, and really in our planning efforts to make sure that we're taking that into consideration in all the future plans we do. New York also is a home rule state, and when it comes to that, we need to work with our localities and really encourage them to update their ordinances for storm protection planning purposes, and also update their building codes and zoning codes to really look at the new reality in which we live in, and moving our infrastructure out of harm's way, recognizing that a lot of it is in harm's way now, and we have to take the steps to get smarter about how we're building and where we're building, so that we don't have the same problems we faced in Hurricane Sandy.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to our last topic just before we open it up for questions from the audience. But the question that we've been asked to talk about was, how have we identified all of the critical resources and infrastructure? And if we haven't, how are we going to go about doing that? How are we going to prioritize? Because we know that there is a limited pool of federal dollars. Even though there will be federal dollars, there's a limited pool, and there's certainly a limited pool of state and municipal dollars, so and private NGO dollars. So, and would you like to start?
Well, I do think we have a couple of tools that are available to us. Representative Albus is here, and he chaired a shoreline preservation task force recently, which came out with some really good recommendations for Connecticut. We have an Office of Long Island Sound that does a lot of planning with our partners in Connecticut. But we do think that there's an opportunity, perhaps using some of this federal money, to establish a coastal center for research and education that could help Connecticut do more extensive and localized mapping, planning, education to help coordinate the challenge that we have with the 169 towns and the home rule situation that we have, so that there is a coordinated response to resiliency planning.
And well, I think that was the focus of the 2100 Commission too, is in New York, was really bringing together all the state agencies that operate in our coastal zone and across the state, getting them all to communicate more together, looking at all the different towns, and making sure that we're working closely with them in the future to work together at really addressing the threats that are facing the state now when it comes to sea level rise and what our future holds with storms as well. And I think New York is taking a lot of good steps now, and it's been encouraging to see the governor really out front prioritizing it.
I noticed we're both sitting here with Representative Aldis's Shoreline Preservation Task Force. He'll be speaking later, but we'll point out that was one response that did just what you would hope government would do. They would get together for the affected legislators and form a group just to talk about it and take in actual evidence. I think one of the other changes, though, on a policy basis was a change that was made earlier. There was a question in the last panel about plans of conservation and development, both a recommendation here and an earlier change to our laws made it clear that towns, as they plan, need to start taking these critical infrastructures and sea level rise into consideration. My experience is, while it is something that happens, unfolds over a decade, those plans do make a difference because it changes how they make decisions and how they identify their resources going on. And I couldn't agree more about the Coastal Center. I think that in order to get the identification and this information out is actually the way that we will become more resilient. We will change the state. We will develop the laws at the state and local level to make a difference. So that's the type of information I think makes a huge difference to us.
Just like to comment about looking forward into the future with what resources might be available, and ask the question, how many times can we afford to go through this kind of thing? And we really need to start thinking of our shorelines more as a commons. And with respect to that, people have talked about upholding zoning codes. I'd like to go to the next step, because zoning boards of appeals in New York State, we have something called an Article 78. And these boards of appeals and the law under Article 78 are really tailored more to protect the individual. But now that we're talking about the cost of moving people out of areas, the cost of cleanup, which I think if you looked at both New York and New Jersey and Connecticut probably is in excess of $1 billion, we really have to begin to educate people that are on boards of appeals and our judges as to the importance to start looking at these areas as commons and not just leaning towards falling for every hardship that somebody comes along with private property in a coastal zone.
Great, thank you. So let's open it up for questions because we're getting perilously close to lunch. I see one in the back.
Yes, hi. I would just like to point out that moving forward, we are all educated about this, and we're taking an academic approach. As it goes forward and you decide what you're going to do, have a public relations aspect that gets the hearts and minds, and this way you can start to work on the responses from the broader public.
I'll tell you one thing on that point. After, again, there was a public hearing in Branford to talk about this, and it was one of the interesting things. Again, it was Representative Aldis's commission. That as someone who started a climate law course and usually talks quite a bit about the denialist literature and brings it up at little news segments in the beginning. Nothing was better than seeing storms of people come through and say, so the sea level rise is rising, climate change is here, protect us. Like, well, this is good. So that there's a certain natural assistance to public education, but that will only last so long.
And towards that too, I'll just add that it's been really helpful to have a strong executive in New York helping to talk about this, because it takes it out of sort of the environmentalist rhetoric and it says, look, a very popular figure in New York understands this and recognizes that we need to change, and it's been helpful to have him sort of leading the charge moving forward.
Okay, we have time for 2 more quick questions.
Yeah, I'd like to ask if the situation in New York and Connecticut limits the use of the Coastal Zone Management Act in the way that Rhode Island has adopted special area management plans. They just started what they call a beach SAMP. It's really a shoreline SAMP. And they are going to take 3 to 5 years to do research, examine the relative vulnerability of different shorelines, and eventually adopt a statewide policy and regulations through the Coastal Zone Management Authority. And Rhode Island does have some limited home rule. They follow Dillon's rule as far as I know. Is this available to New York and Connecticut, or is it just never been sort of explored?
Let me start that one for a second. Knowing something about Rhode Island from people that were involved in it up at Brown University, Carolyn Karp did some work in that area. They've adopted what's sort of a strong form or squishier kind of approach. Our approach, I would say it's not available under the current way we're doing it. We have, clearly there's a demarcation line at the high tide line between the deep and the state, but we do have the Office of Long Island Sounds program that provides advice above it. Rhode Island system, if I understand it, sort of takes that interim area and makes the what would be the state response and the state planning much, much stronger. I think it's something that could be available to us. I think as someone who's in a municipality, we would welcome it, in order to get broader planning on it. And that's probably the direction, frankly, that I think a lot of people might ultimately come out of this, but it's not something that we're doing currently, if I understand it correctly.
I think that's correct.
Okay. One last question. Oh my goodness. Right.
I'm just interested in this squishy idea for New York State, and where can we read about it? Where can we find out about it? Where is Rhode Island enacted it? Is it in the laws, or where can we find out more about it?
Since I'm here to talk about Connecticut, I'll do my best for Rhode Island. I believe they enacted it well over a year ago, about a year and a half ago. And where to go, I couldn't tell you. I'd go to their feed.
Well, if you went to the CRMC, that's the Coastal Resources Management Council, they administer the Coastal Zone Management Act in Rhode Island. They'll have plenty of information at that site.
And the SAMP actually, URI, the folks who've been feeding data into the SAMP has its own website. So you can just Google Rhode Island SAMP and SAMP.